Last summer was a trip. For the most part, I spent it hanging out with my friends, enjoying our last summer before all heading off to college. This meant that we were either going to the swimming holes or bonfires and having a blast. It also meant that we were being little punks a lot of the time, especially if you ran into us in the evening. We were always up to something wild and stupid. This one night, after having a small pool party, I was driving back home and I had my buddy Dan in the car. It was around 1 a.m, and the road was covered in fog, so we were driving slowly. We may have been stupid, but we always drive safe. As we made our way down the road, Dan pointed out something weird just off the side of the road. It looked like someone was dragging something into the woods next to the street. Dan convinced me to stop for a second and try to get a better look, so I did. And then Dan cracked his window. Immediately, I asked him not to do it. I could tell something shady was going on. Dan didn't listen though. He loudly yelled, "What are you doing?" But he put on a deep, gravelly voice. So of course, we started cracking up. That was when the figure in the fog stood up straight and turned toward us. I felt chills roll down my spine as it slowly began to back up more and more away from the side of the road and deeper into the fog until it was out of sight. I turned to Dan to talk about what just happened, and we were both equally confused. Then Dan's eyes grew wide, and without saying anything, I could tell that something was behind me. As I turned around to look out my window, I nearly flew out of my seat. A man with a face covered in mud was pressed against the driver's side window of my car. I shouted and quickly threw the car into drive and floored it. I had never been so freaked out in my life. That was until Dan pointed out that he didn't think it was mud on his face. He thought it was dried blood. We got to my house and sprinted inside, even though there were no way that the man could have followed up. I wish it had ended there, but 2 days later, Dan and I were watching the news. Authorities found a body in the woods, not far from where we saw that man. It was the body of an elderly woman who had been bludgeoned to death. I told my father about what happened, and he figured I should report what Dan and I had seen that night. So we called the police, and they asked us to come in to give a statement. I'm not sure if it did any good, as I tried to forget that night, which means I tend not to look into the status of that case at all. It was the middle of December back in 2009, and my family and I had been attending the company's Christmas party. This was an annual thing, and my kid loved it. The company would hire someone to dress up as Santa, and it was nice for the workers because it was usually when we were given our bonuses. It had been a slow year for the company, but we were all happy with what we were given. And all in all, the evening at the party was a hit. The drive home, not so much. We loaded up into our Dodge Caravan and got a movie set up for our son, although we knew he would fall asleep shortly after we got moving. I remember as we were leaving, one of my coworkers laughed and said that I had the right idea because a snowstorm was heading that way and it was safer to leave the party then. I hadn't heard anything about a storm, so I just assumed he meant a flurry. No big deal. Nothing we weren't used to driving in. So we started down the road, and within a matter of minutes, my wife let me know that our son had nodded off, so we turned down the volume of the speakers. And it wasn't long after that we began to see the snowflakes hit the high beams of the car. Again, this wasn't anything new, so we weren't too concerned. I slowed down a bit, of course, but no big deal. Or so I thought. After a few minutes of light flurries, they began to get larger, and within a matter of seconds, we couldn't see the road ahead of us. It was just coming down. In hindsight, if I had been paying attention to the news all week, I would have known that we were expecting a small blizzard in our area. We tried our best to make it home, but at some point, we had to make a decision to pull over. We had quite a bit of windy roads down the mountain to get home, and with our kid in the car, it just didn't seem safe. I pulled the car over and we were on a slight hill, so I made sure to put the emergency brake up. We made sure to bundle up in blankets we had lying in the back of the van for emergencies, and did our best to get comfortable. Our son thought it was like a camping trip, so he was totally fine with the situation. However, a bad situation would turn worse after a few hours. I'm still not quite sure what caused the snow to begin to freeze. Maybe it was a rise and dip in the temperature, but somehow, while we were asleep, the entire road of the hill in front of us became a sheet of ice. And I'm not sure if it was us tossing and turning in our sleep that shifted the van ever so slightly, but somehow the ice ended up under our tires and I awoke to our van sliding rapidly downhill. My wife woke up and quickly wrapped her arms around our son while I tried to figure out something to do. But I knew right away there was nothing. The emergency brake was already up. There was no way to stop us unless we happened to just stop on our own. I could tell we were picking up serious momentum, so I too joined my wife and our son in an embrace and got ready for the worst to happen. Then out of nowhere, bam, I heard the back of the van smash into something, but we stopped. I checked on my family, and they were all okay. When I checked to see what stopped the van, it turned out to be a large rock just big enough for the bottom of the van to get launched onto it. The bone-chilling part is had we not stopped, the van would have likely slid right off the side of the mountain at a steep 20-plus foot drop-off. Working as a driver for DoorDash has been a pretty good side job ever since I moved to Converse, Texas. I mainly pick up deliveries inside of San Antonio, but sometimes I will find ones that take me out of Converse and a bit into the country. Now, I used to not mind those deliveries, and I would pretty much accept any job that I could handle, but after this one incident that brought me to a Texas ranch, I will no longer go outside of the cities of Converse and San Antonio. It was around 8:30 p.m., and I picked up an order that brought me out to the middle of nowhere. That's the crazy thing about Texas. 1 second, you can be in a big city, and the next, there is practically nothing around you for miles. As I drove around looking for the entryway onto this massive property, I began following a large fence that ran alongside the street. I figured the fence would eventually lead me to the entryway, and I was correct. I pulled into a small driveway that led me to a large electric gate with a number pad that required a code to get in. I wasn't given a code, so I decided to contact the person who sent out the order. They responded within a minute with a text that read, the code pound 6660. Welcome to the family. I was confused by that last line, but I leaned out of my car window and punched in the code, chuckling to myself at the fact that they used 666 for a code. After a second, the gate made a loud banging sound and then slowly slid open across rust-covered tracks. The gate opened to reveal a long, winding pathway with trees lining both sides of it. They must have been planted there by the owners a while back because they looked oddly out of place compared to the barren fields that surrounded the ranch. I began to make my way down the driveway, and I couldn't help but shake the creepy feeling that was coming over me. I was on edge, which I'm glad for because as I rounded one of the small bends, in the middle of the driveway, my headlights revealed a tall, pale man wearing a dirt-covered black suit. We stared at each other for a moment without either of us moving. I was in shock. Eventually, I got the courage to roll my window down a bit and yell out, "Did you order the takeout?" But he didn't answer. All he did was step to the side and point down the driveway, as if telling me to continue. Reluctantly, I did. I continued down the pathway, and behind every couple of trees, I can't help but think that I see more people dressed up in a similar suit as the man who had been standing in the driveway. Still, I continued on. Finally, I could see a house in front of me, but as if it was something out of my worst nightmare. Standing on the porch of the large house and along the outside of the driveway were at least a dozen or more men, all dressed in dirt-covered suits, some black and some gray. I froze. I didn't know what to do, but I knew for a fact that nothing could make me get out of my car at that moment. After sitting in the driveway, staring at the group of strange men, I noticed that one of them had something in their hand. My eyes widened as I realized what it was, and I quickly threw the car into reverse. One of the men on the porch was carrying a rifle of sort. I wasn't close enough to see what kind it was, but I knew it was a firearm of some sort. I slammed my foot on the gas and began swinging my car around in reverse to turn around so that I could drive out of there as fast as I could. At that point, I noticed a few of the men now begun walking toward my car. After fully turning around, I put my car into drive and began flooring it. I let out a scream as I heard a loud bang followed by my rear windshield shattering. I leaned forward and made my head as low as possible while still being able to see over the dashboard. As I made my way down the driveway, every tree that I passed, I could see a man stepping out from behind it and walking toward the path that I had been driving down. Luckily, none of them seemed to be armed. I made it out of the driveway and onto the road, and as I passed the still open gate, I noticed that it began to close. They were trying to trap me inside with them. I sped down the road and called 911 as I made my way to the police station and explained to them what just happened to me. They were confused when I told them the address because they were familiar with it, and it had apparently been an abandoned property for the past decade. By the time the officers made it to the ranch, however, they said it appeared to still be abandoned and there was no one around. 3 hours after I finally got home, around 2:30 a.m., I received a text message saying, "Where'd you go? It was just getting fun." That was the last time I ever took an order outside of the city. It was during our 2008 family vacation. My family, which included my wife Frances and our son Benny, decided to go on vacation in Northern California. We had always wanted to camp out among the redwoods, and we had heard of a campground that Frances's family used to go to, so we thought it would be the perfect excursion, and at first it was. We were all having a blast, going on hikes and watching all the wildlife running around. There were quite a few trails surrounding the cabins that we got to stay in, so we decided that every day we would go hiking down a different trail. That way, we could enjoy as much as we could during our 2-week stay. It was our 4th day in, and after eating some breakfast, we all got our backpacks and water bottles ready and decided to head down one of the greener trails. This one hadn't been as cleared off as other ones we had gone down in our earlier days at camp, but we weren't concerned. It was still clearly a path, and it hadn't seemed likely that we would lose it or get lost on it. We made our way down the trail as we gawked at the beautiful trees and flora along the trail. It was absolutely beautiful, at least until it was interrupted by something. As we walked, none of us were talking. We had just been enjoying the sounds and sights around us when all of a sudden, we heard the sound of footsteps walking in the dirt behind us. I stopped and turned around to see who or what might have been following us, but I didn't see anything. I figured it had been a deer or something and was not a big deal, but we were all still a bit on edge and decided to head back to the campground and hang out near the cabin while we calmed down. The rest of the day was uneventful, and eventually we all turned in to go to sleep, and just as my eyes began to get heavy, I heard the sound of something shuffling around outside our cabin. I sat up and was getting ready to walk to the door to check it out when all of a sudden a voice from outside calmly asked, "Can I help you?" I wasn't sure if they were talking to me or if there was something else going on, but then I heard the sound of footsteps walking up the porch of the cabin, and again I heard them ask, "Can I help you?" Only now they were right on the other side of the door, Francis and Benny had both woken up this time, and Francis looked at me wondering what was going on. Then, without any of us saying a word, we all heard the sound of the footsteps leaving the porch and then the campground. I immediately sprang up and made sure the door was locked and moved the dresser in front of it. Francis and I spoke about it and decided that the next day we would all walk through the trail back to our car and leave the campsite early. We didn't think it was safe anymore. So after a long night, just waiting and wondering if the person was going to come back, thankfully they didn't, at least not that we know of. The next morning, we all packed up as quickly as we could and began making our way down the trail and to our car. It was about a 10-minute walk, so we weren't expecting anything to happen. But then, out of nowhere, just like the day before, the sounds of footsteps from behind us. And this time, we knew it was the person who had visited our cabin last night. I told Francis and Benny to run, and I followed behind them, placing myself between them and whoever was following us. As we ran to the car, we could hear yelling through the trees. All they kept saying was, "Can I help you?" The yelling progressively got more aggressive, but we managed to make it safely back to the car. As soon as we were inside, we locked the doors and pulled off. As we were leaving, all three of us saw a man wearing a torn-up flannel and blue jeans walking out of the woods with a sinister grin on his face. As we sped off, I could see him waving in the rearview mirror. It was 2002, and I decided that it was time for me to make something of myself. However, I always had a tendency to backtrack on my goals. Something that a lot of people told me was that I never give myself time to relax. So I was going to take the year off and travel across the country. I had saved up some money from the years of working, and I did the math. If I spent my money sparingly and I picked up some odd jobs along the way, I should have been more than capable of lasting the year on what I had saved. My plan was simple. I took a flight from Chicago to New York, and from there, I would travel around each state to see what the rest of the country had to offer outside of my small hometown. Things started off really well. For the first few weeks, I traveled via bus or train from city to city, enjoying as much as I could while remaining on my budget. Something I quickly found out, that it was fairly hard to snag a quick, paying job in a town you were only going to be in for a day or two. This meant that I would have to figure out a way to save a bit of money, and to be honest, I probably went about the situation the wrong way, because for some reason, the best way I could think of to save money would be if I could find a cheaper way to travel. That was when I decided to try my hand at hitchhiking. Excuse the pun. I walked along the side of a highway in Virginia for about 45 minutes, alternating between which hand I was using to attempt to flag someone down. And finally, I was happy to see a small two-door sedan slowly pull off. As I approached the passenger side door, I noticed that it was only the driver in the car. He seemed like a clean-cut and older gentleman who had no facial hair but wore circular glasses like Lennon. He asked where I was heading, and I explained to him that any town with a cheap place to stay would be great, and he said he could drop me off in a city about 10 miles away, which sounded amazing at the time. So I thanked him graciously and hopped into the passenger seat of his car. At first, things seemed like they were going great, and it turned out that he apparently grew up not too far from me, or at least that's what he told me. Maybe he was just trying to get me to lower my guard. After we passed an off-ramp that I thought was going to take us to the city he told me about, I asked him how far away we are, and his answer was one that I never wanted to hear. He said, "We're about 3 hours away from your new home." I was confused. I began to chuckle a bit, hoping that it was some weird joke that I didn't understand. That was when I saw him press the switch to lock the doors. "What are you doing?" I asked. That's when I saw him pull a gun out from the panel of his door. He pointed the handgun in my direction and told me to just relax. And I don't know what came over me, but I knew I had to do something. I reached for the gun in hopes of either getting it from him or distracting him enough to crash his car, but he was quicker. I didn't feel the bullet hit me, but the ringing in my ears was enough to make me almost pass out. The stranger that I had entrusted had just shot me. We drove for a little while longer. I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was so dazed by the situation. The bullet had entered in the left side of my chest. I felt my eyes growing heavy, and I could hear him muttering to himself. Everything after that came to me in pieces. I vaguely remember pulling off of the highway. Then we were in the woods. I was pulled from the car and left lying next to a tree. I'll never forget the relief it felt when I heard his tires skid as he pulled away. I think he thought I was dead or going to die. Hell, I did too. Lucky for me, I still had my phone. I was able to call emergency services. It took them some time to find me, and by the time they got there, I had already passed out, assuming I would never wake up again. Thankfully, I did. I woke up in the ambulance where I was told that I was going to be fine, and they were taking me to the hospital. Apparently, the bullet went in and out, meaning that it went on a straight path and didn't bounce around or break up inside of me, causing massive internal damage. I ended my trip then and there, and once I was able to fly home, I did. My friends always told me I was too trusting of strangers. Not anymore. Working the night shift at a gas station, you tend to see some characters. Most of them are night owls who are relatively harmless, but every now and then, you get a visitor in your store that seems like they could be dangerous. I'll never forget an encounter I had with a man when I worked at the Exxon Mobil gas station in the town next to mine. I had worked there for about a year at that point and was pretty used to the weird people I would see. There was one day that made things a lot less comfortable for me though, and it resulted in me talking to the police. You see, I was working my shift and it was just after 1 a.m. It was a slow day. Just a few people had stopped for gas, and most of them paid at the pump, so I was mainly just enjoying time in the store by myself. That was until a man came in and made his way back to the beer cooler. At first, I didn't think anything about it. Most of the people who came in at night who didn't get gas got beer. However, when I noticed what the man was wearing, I got a bit on edge. I noticed that his t-shirt had multiple tears in it, and when he turned back toward the register, I could see the front of his shirt and jeans had brownish red stains on them. Now, I try not to judge people who came into the store. Everyone is living their own life, but there was something off about this guy. As he made his way to the counter with a single 40-ounce bottle of beer in his hands, I couldn't help but notice his eyes. They were covered in bloodshot veins, and his upper lip kept twitching. He put the beer on the counter and locked eyes with me. So I asked him if that would be everything, and he didn't say a word. So I figured that was all he wanted, and I told him the total. I don't know if he could tell that I thought something was off with him, but he just stared at me and slowly took a step backward. I told him the total of the beer again and asked him if he wanted a bag with that. But again, there was no answer. Now I was really getting uneasy. I knew something was up, and I couldn't handle it anymore. I took the beer off the counter and told the man that I needed him to leave the gas station before I called the police, and that was when he began to move to the door, all without breaking eye contact with me. But instead of opening the door, he went to turn the lock. I knew how serious the situation was at this point. I pretended to reach for something under the counter, hoping that he would think I was reaching for a gun. As luck would have it, he did, and he quickly unlocked the door and sprinted out of the store. I immediately called the police, and to my surprise, there was an officer at the gas station in less than a minute. After I told him about the man with the stains on his clothes, he told me about something horrible that happened that same night. Apparently, the reason the police got there so fast was that they were already out on a call. They found a man's body on the side of the road. He had been stabbed multiple times, but police managed to find pieces of ripped clothing near the body. They believed that it belonged to the killer, and they believe that whoever it was the man in my shop just a few minutes before. I showed the officers my security footage and told them the direction he ran. I don't know what would have happened had he not been scared by me reaching under the counter. If he had called my bluff, he would have quickly learned the only thing that I kept under the counter was the bathroom key. I probably wouldn't have made it out of the store that night. Do you know how it's most teenagers' dream to be left home alone by their parents for an extended period of time? Well, after what happened to me the first weekend that I had been left home alone, that was something I personally dreaded. You see, I had just started my sophomore year of high school, and I had always been a responsible kid. So when my parents' anniversary came around, they asked me if they could trust me to be alone by myself for 2 nights while they went on a small trip. I loved the idea, and at the time, I couldn't get them out of the house fast enough. The following week dragged on, but soon enough it was Friday, and I knew by the time I got home from school, my parents would have been gone, and I would have the house to myself. The first thing I did when I got home was turned on the TV and grabbed my laptop to start contacting my friends. I didn't want to throw a party that weekend, but I definitely planned on having a few friends over to watch some movies and enjoy the empty house. I logged into Facebook and saw that no one was online, so I figured I would check back in an hour or so. I figured to pass the time, I would watch some South Park and scroll through Reddit. As I was sitting on the couch, the hours began to pass, and I hadn't heard from any of my friends. I figured they were just busy though, and I would hear from them later. I began to make dinner for myself. I was just going to make some pasta and sauce, but before I could even turn the burner for the stove on, I heard a knock at my door. I paused for a moment and was curious as to who might be knocking when I heard it again. Only this time the knocking was a lot louder, and I figured it was just one of my friends that probably decided to just stop by unannounced. I yelled out for whoever was knocking to hang on and told them that I would get to the door in a second. I made my way out of the kitchen and down the small hallway that led to the front door. The person on the other side was still pounding on it. I yelled louder for them to stop and told them that I was coming to answer the door. Before opening it, I decided to look through the peephole just to make sure it was actually one of my friends on the other side. But when I got a good look, I tossed myself away from the door. Standing on my front porch was a full-grown man who appeared to be covering his face with a ski mask or hat of sorts. Before I could react any further, I heard a smashing sound from the other side of my house. Someone had broken through the sliding door in the kitchen. I tried to run through the hallway and get into my room so I could hide away, but before I could make it 10 feet, the person who had broken through the kitchen door already had their hands on me. I was thrown into the wall and then onto the ground. The intruder bound my arms behind my back and tied them together with rope they had brought with them. And after opening the front door for his accomplice, the two walked over to my basement stairs and tossed me down. I hardly felt it, as my head bounced off multiple stairs on my way down. As I was laying on the cold concrete floor, I could hear the sound of men rummaging through my house above me. They were only inside for what seemed like 15 or 20 minutes before I heard them both running out of the front door. I tried my best to get up, but anytime I got close, I would get dizzy and drop back to the floor. I ended up being trapped on my basement floor for the entire night before I was finally found. My parents called the police after I didn't contact them the night before or that morning and asked them to stop by and check on me. After my parents found out what happened, they rushed back from their trip and met me at the hospital. I was fine aside from a mild concussion, but the thieves ended up getting away with more than $6,000 worth of jewelry and electronics from my parents' room. As far as we know, The intruders were never found. After spending about a week with my family in Dallas, my girlfriend and I began making our long trip back to New York. It was supposed to be a 40-hour drive, but we spent one night at a Red Roof Inn to split up the drive a bit. The entire way we both alternated, with each of us taking turns as the driver. All in all, it was a really enjoyable trip at first. We stopped whenever we needed to and made sure to stay stocked on road snacks. Things took a turn for the worse though. It was our second night of driving after stopping at a Red Roof. The plan was to drive through the night, and by around 4 p.m. the next day, we would be back in New York. Sure, we would be tired, but at least we would be sleeping in our own bed. It was my turn to drive, and as I continued down the highway, I could feel myself losing focus and almost drifting off. So instead of waking up Diana and asking her to take over, I made a dumb decision. I figured I could get off the highway and use the GPS to take some smaller roads. At least then, I would have to focus on all the turns the GPS would be having me make. Honestly, it worked like a charm. As I found myself keeping an eye out for street signs, I was more focused and therefore more awake. The road we were on had no streetlights on it. The only illumination was coming from my car as I drove along. I'll never forget the feeling that came over me as I began to round the bend that was up ahead of us. On the right side of the road, all you could see was high-reaching cornfields, and to the left was an open field that separated the road from the tree line. As we rounded the bend, Diana was woken up as she flew forward in her seat. All you could hear in the car were the sounds of the tires screeching on the asphalt. Diana was confused and asked me what was going on, and all I could do was point. She followed my fingers and was shocked at what was standing in the middle of the road in the center of our headlights. There was a single man who appeared to be wearing a thick-looking jacket, even though it was nearly 75 degrees outside. Neither of us knew what to do. The man just stood there and stared at us as we sat there frozen. That was when I noticed what was dangling down from his right hand. He was wielding a large blade-looking object. I couldn't quite make out whether it was a large knife or a small chopping blade like a machete, and we didn't care to find out either. All I could think to do was throw the car in reverse and make a quick turnaround. As soon as the man heard me throw the car into gear, he began moving toward the two of us. I slammed my foot on the gas and waited till we were far enough away to begin turning around. As we peeled away, I could see the man getting close to our taillights through the rearview mirror. But as we began to put distance between us, all I could hear was a loud banging on the trunk. I looked in the mirror and didn't see anything. So Diana and I just drove as fast as we could to the nearest gas station that looked open. After making sure it was safe to stop, I got out of the car to take a look at the trunk. That was when I saw an indent in the trunk that looked like something pointed had hit it. All I can think is that he either threw his knife at us as we drove away, or he managed to get close enough to hit the car when we turned around. Either way, we were both glad to be out of that situation, and we got home as fast as we could. Growing up in Rockland County in New York, one of the most interesting places to visit was the abandoned Letchwood Village, which at one point was a major psychiatric center in that region. A more interesting fact about Letchworth is that it has since been named one of the most haunted places in the United States, which turned it into a hotspot for paranormal investigators even though it was private property. Now, I personally haven't experienced anything that I would refer to as paranormal, but a group of friends and I have been followed around by something on the property. It was the last time I decided to go with my friends to take pictures in the abandoned asylum, and because we had been there on many occasions, we weren't too worried about security, much less the paranormal rumors. So we casually made our way onto the property through the woods, along the outside of the premises, and began exploring the trashed and empty rooms and hallways, taking pictures of anything we thought seemed artsy to a bunch of teenagers. And as we were exploring one of the larger buildings, we all stopped in our tracks as we thought we heard something outside. Our minds immediately thought it was security, so we did our best to stay quiet and keep away from any windows until the coast was clear. And after a few moments of silence and no more sound outside, we continued walking the halls, only now we were being fairly cautious of our surroundings. Over the next 20 minutes or so, it was rather quiet, and we thought that any threat that was coming our way had passed. However, just as we let our guard down, we heard the sound of a door slamming closed. Only it wasn't the main door to the building, so it wasn't anyone coming in from outside. Instead, it was the door of a room that was down the hallway from where we were, a room that didn't have any windows that were accessible from the outside, meaning that whoever closed the door was in the room as we passed by it. I could feel the hair on my arms and neck standing and the sensation of chills rolling up and down my spine. Without sharing any words, we all looked at one another and began running to the nearest exit. As we all stumbled outside, we were happy to see that nothing or no one was following us. We all caught our breath and decided that it was probably just a breeze or something anyway, and we all had a good laugh about what happened. And believe it or not, we decided to stay and check out another building while there was still daylight. The building was similar to the first one we were in, only a bit smaller. As soon as we walked inside, we found a few good shots for the camera and had all but forgotten about our terrifying experience from moments before. We were soon reminded of it though, as we all stopped everything we were doing when we heard the sound of the main door rattling. It was as if someone was pushing against it and pulling on it repeatedly, but without holding the button down that unlocks the latch on the door, allowing it to open. We all stared at the door for a second, but as soon as we saw it begin to crack open and light begin to seep through, we all took off deeper into the building. Lucky for us, there was a broken window that had been used to unlock the door from the inside one of the first times we explored. We all sprinted to and through the empty window as fast as we could and made our way to the tree line. Once we were out of sight of the abandoned facility, we made sure that everyone was with us and began discussing what it could have been. We had gone to Letchworth at least 10 times and had never had a run-in like that one. Have you ever had someone randomly add you on Snapchat? Well, maybe after you hear what happened to me, you might not accept the request next time. You see, while I was in college, I got a random request and I accepted it. I just assumed it was a classmate, and I would find out who it was when they messaged me or snapped me. It wasn't long before I started getting some really weird messages. No pictures. They only used the chat feature at first. They would send me things like, "I'll see you after statistics class," or "How was your lunch?" Only they would know exactly what I ate. It was clear that someone knew my schedule and was watching me, but I honestly just figured it was one of my friends playing some weird prank on me. I didn't pay it any mind and often responded with a joke answer or something. But one day, that wasn't going particularly well for me. I was a bit cranky, and when I got a message from the person, I basically told them either to tell me who they are or leave me alone. Immediately, they became aggressive, asking me who I think I am and saying that they are always watching me. So that weekend, I decided to go home and spend some time with my family and old friends to unwind. I told them about everything that was happening, and they agreed that it was probably one of my friends being a jerk. But that night, when I was sitting in my room, I received a message from them saying, "Come out." I was confused, so I chose not to answer. About 2 minutes later, I heard a knock at the door. I froze with fear. I was so worried it was the person who was threatening me. But how would they have followed me home from school? I had my Snap Map location turned off. My father ended up answering the door, and apparently, no one was there. Right after he closed the door, I received my first picture from the person who was threatening me. I was afraid to open, but eventually I did. It was a picture taken of my dad at the door looking around for whoever knocked. They were right outside my house, messing with me. Me and my family agreed that it would be safer for us to notify the cops, so we called 911. When they showed up, they couldn't find anyone, but told us to call them if anything else happened. I immediately blocked their Snapchat and admittedly didn't sleep that night. For the next few weeks, everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. I ended up transferring to a different college between semesters, and I didn't move out of my parents' home until earlier this year. Not because I couldn't financially, but because I didn't want to be living alone and have those people start harassing me again somehow. Now, I have a small house of my own and a big St. Bernard who is not only my best friend but my guardian in case someone should ever try to hurt me or my family.